Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the Senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. Welcome to this week's edition of Kibbitzing with Kagan, brief conversations with people I find fascinating. My very special guest today is Sharon Camp, often described as the mother of Plan B or the morning after pill. Sharon, thank you so much for making time to chat today.
It's entirely my pleasure.
Thank you. So I have to admit to being a little intimidated and a little nervous, which is not my normal style. And you are not, you don't come off as an intimidating person, but I have so many things I want to talk to you about. And you are just such a shero for all women, whether or not they've ever heard of you. So I want to start at the beginning, and then we're going to fast forward to abortion politics and medicine and all of that.
Sure.
So you grew up in the Mojave Desert. Your mother was blind, and you were an older sister with two young. You were the eldest with two younger
Yep.
sisters. Talk to me about your childhood and what that was like before you went off to school at Pomona and then Johns Hopkins.
Oh, well, I loved growing up in the desert. You can stand on a little hill and see 50 miles. It's a very special place. And I had a horse very early on, and I would go out and ride in the desert for hours at a time, and we would share my bologna sandwich and
Nice.
and
With the
ride down to
horse.
with my horse. Yeah.
Okay.
She ate the bread and I ate the bologna.
Um,
Yeah, I grew up on a Navy base, actually. My dad was a rocket scientist,
yes.
and they were testing rockets out there in the middle of the desert. So that's where I
Amazing.
grew up.
And tell me about what your role was with your mom, who taught Braille.
Well, I was her eyes. She did teach Braille for a while, and she was quite remarkable. Her other senses were highly developed. So if you dropped a coin on a hard floor, she could tell you whether it was a quarter or a dime or a nickel. Just
Wow.
amazing hearing. And she had kind of a sixth sense so that she didn't walk into things. And if you didn't move the furniture around, she
Yeah.
was perfectly comfortable moving around the house.
Hmm.
And she had a little vision in the corner of one eye and a set of magnifying glasses. And she would read recipes word by word and cook.
Wow.
She was a wonderful hostess. So she was a great role model. And so was my dad, smartest person I ever knew.
Amazing. That's fantastic. Um, so going to college and then getting two graduate degrees, a master's and a PhD, wasn't so common for women. What was it like? How many other women were in your classes?
There were very few role models in the 60s.
Yes.
Very few women who had both a family and a career. And at one point, I decided I really wanted the career. But when I was a senior at Pomona, I was applying to graduate schools, and I went to one of my government professors and asked for a recommendation. And he said, "No, I'm not writing you a recommendation. You're going to take up a space in graduate school that a young man who's going to have to support a family could have, and you'll just get married and have children and waste your degree."
Mm.
So this was a professor at a
Wow.
liberal arts college, and that was his attitude toward women in graduate school. So
And your
it was,
parents, your
the big difference that made it for me was when I got my first doctorate, and old men had to call me Dr. Camp. It made all the difference in the world in the way I was perceived. So
abs
any young woman who comes to me and says, "Well, should I, stop at a master's or go for a doctorate?" I always tell them, go for the doctorate.
yeah.
In whatever subject, it doesn't matter, just so you can call yourself doctor.
I had many years ago, I had a lovely woman as my legislative aide, my chief of staff, and turns out she's a lawyer. And there was a white guy lobbyist who came in here. And once we were in the meeting and he realized that she was an attorney, the whole tenor of the meeting changed.
Exactly.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
So how did you start into population policy? You began a Population Action International, and then were the founder, president, and CEO of the Women's Capital Corporation, and we'll get to that. But how did you start down this road?
Well, I wanted to work in international studies, which was my undergraduate and graduate degree. And the job came along to work on international population and family planning issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I loved the idea that I could get involved not only in that, but in all kinds of tangential issues like the environment, women's development, human rights. So it allowed me to look at a broad spectrum of global development issues while working specifically on reproductive health and rights, which was a real passion for me.
So in 1997, you founded this company that
Right.
ultimately created this brilliant drug that has touched countless women. Talk to me about that journey.
Well, I kind of fell into it because I was a public interest lobbyist for nearly 20 years and had gotten involved with activists around the issue of emergency contraception.
Mm-hmm.
And we lobbied the pharmaceutical industry, not only in the United States, but in Europe, to bring out a product that was labeled and packaged for this particular use. And they wouldn't touch it with a barge pole. So after 20 years and no experience, relevant experience at all, I started this tiny pharmaceutical company. And
Unbelievable.
it was financed entirely by nonprofits. And they all, made a good return on their money when Plan B was sold to a bigger pharmaceutical company. And a number of Planned Parenthoods were a part of the investment group. So it's a
Amazing.
wonderful story.
So I'm going to want you to tell the story. I am holding up to the screen for those who are on Apple Podcasts. You don't get to see the visual, but I'm holding up a box of Plan B, One Step. So talk about the name, because you shared the story of the name Plan B and the pushback that you got.
That's such a great story.
So great.
We actually got together a whole bunch of stakeholders to pick that name, and we all agreed it was the right name because it was the right public health message.
Yes.
We think you should have a Plan A, but if life happens, you can go to Plan B.
Yes.
But we got a letter from the FDA about a month into
Food
the
and Drug Administration,
Food and Drug
which has to
Administration
give approval.
they were reviewing the new drug application, and they said, your trade name is not approved, submit another. And I resisted that. And our regulatory consultant said, Sharon, industry never wins these battles with the Food and Drug Administration. Just pick a new name. And I wasn't going to have that. So, we appealed, and I asked for the minutes of the committee that made this decision, called the Nomenclature and Labeling Committee.
Okay.
And when the minutes came, they said simply, the trade name is not approved because it's frivolous and has a meaningless B suffix. Does that make any sense?
None.
to you?
None.
So, that couldn't be left to stand. And so over the next few months, we appealed and lost and appealed and lost. And finally, we were about to get approved without a trade name.
Mm.
And the appeal reached the desk of Janet Woodcock, who was then head of the center that reviews drugs and later FDA commissioner.
Uh-huh.
And she overruled multiple layers of bureaucracy in a letter that said basically, this is the perfect name for this product.
Absolutely.
And then
And it took a woman. Were all
it took a woman.
committee members men? Do we know
Right. But the punchline is, a month later, after the approval, the Washington Post called the trade name Inspired.
that? I love that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
isn't that a great story?
Sharon, you were like a badass before people were calling women badass. So talk about
or just naive. I didn't know
that.
what I couldn't do.
Persistent. Nevertheless,
Yeah,
she
yeah.
persisted. You were a foremother on all of this. Talk about, for folks who may not know, because a lot of people don't, talk about what Plan B is, what it does, and how it works. in
Okay.
plain English.
Well, I'll try and keep it simple.
Yes.
One of the female hormones is called progesterone,
Mhm.
and it's essential to the maintenance of pregnancy. Plan B's active ingredients is a progestin, which is a synthetic version of that.
Mhm.
So this is why it can't cause abortion. It sustains pregnancy. And it works mainly by suppressing ovulation, which means the release of an egg from the ovary.
Mhm.
It either suppresses it or delays it. It may, and the National Institutes of Health researchers think it might also interfere with sperm and their ability to fertilize, but it has no post-fertilization effect at all. And people have tried to prove that in clinical studies, and you can't demonstrate it at all.
Okay, so
So
let's go
it's
back to
not an
like,
abortion pill. It doesn't work if you're already pregnant.
thank you. So let's go back to 5th grade or whatever age you learned. There's an egg and there's a sperm, and you need the sperm to fertilize the egg in order to start making a person, and
Yes.
to start having a pregnancy. So if the release of the egg is delayed, then the sperm are swimming around, but they got nothing to work with.
Right.
So there's no pregnancy.
Yeah, there's no pregnancy. An egg is only viable for 24 hours after it's released. So, the timing has to be just right.
Yes.
Yeah,
Which is why so many couples have troubles when they're trying to
exactly.
conceive.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So what was the reaction? So you got the name, you got the approval, and I don't know that we have time for the packaging story, although the packaging story was brilliant too. If you can tell it
It was
really
fun.
fast.
Yeah.
Go ahead, because I do love the punchline on the
Oh,
one.
you want me? I'll try and tell it really quickly.
Let's see if you
So
can tell
the
it.
packaging was not approved. Was not approved because it didn't meet FDA guidelines. Well, I'd never read any guidelines, so what did I know? I designed the package that made sense to me for a 16-year-old date rape survivor.
Yes.
But we had a fight with the FDA over it, and it got kind of rough for a while, but in the end, the FDA decided they'd like to work with us on our packaging concept, and we got it all worked out. And the next year, at the annual meeting of the American Pharmaceutical Packaging Association,
Who knew?
they named Plan B Package of the Year, and it beat out the Viagra Starter Pack by 1 vote.
I love that. Love that. So what was the reaction, and how much marketing was needed to spread the word so that women and men knew about the availability
Yeah.
of this new drug?
Well, it was again kind of a unique story. We had no marketing budget. We were funded by foundations and universities and nonprofit organizations, but all of those were partners. So we partnered with a wide variety of mainly nonprofit organizations to spread the word. And, the foundations funded public education campaigns. We had a sales force that had 5 people in it.
Wow.
But, part of what helped us in the marketing was that, there was substantial controversy at first. And so we got a whole lot of
Free press.
free press.
Yeah.
And so by the time Plan B was on the market, there was
Yes.
quite a bit of knowledge. And then when we submitted the application to take it over the counter,
Yes.
to move it from prescription to non-prescription, and then it took the FDA forever to approve it, and then forever to drop the age restriction on it. All of that generated publicity because it was controversy after controversy after
Yes.
controversy. So I think that's how a lot of people learned about it. They didn't learn about it from a sales force or advertising,
Sure.
but we did get quite a bit of free advertising.
Yes.
One of the major print advertising companies actually gave us free space,
Nice.
treated as a public education campaign.
Bless
So,
them. That's great.
yeah.
So let's go. So pre-Dobbs, pre the Supreme Court undoing Roe versus Wade, let's just talk. What was the trajectory for medical abortions versus surgical abortion?
It was growing very slowly. And, I was very involved in the early days of medication abortion, lobbying to get it here. And we all assumed at the time that the fight over abortion would go away because you would be able to get this at any doctor's office. There wouldn't be abortion clinics that people could protest.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, I was debating the head of the National Right to Life Committee on the McNeil-Lehrer show. And the producer told me afterwards that he had told her that if this ever came to market, their movement would die.
Hmm.
And that's what we believe too.
Yes.
But it turned out that it was only providers who were already doing abortion that offered medication abortion. And again, it was a tiny company, largely funded by foundations. Same kind of story as Plan B. And so, there wasn't a lot of marketing going on. But just in the last couple of years since Dobbs, the sales of mifepristone, the abortion pill, have doubled to over 14 million units. So it's suddenly spreading very fast. And the internet is a huge help because
Yes.
there are a lot of helpful organizations now that are aiding women in getting access to mail order abortion pills. In
Yes.
fact, one of those groups is called Plan C. And it's a couple of old friends of mine who were involved in Plan B.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Small world.
Let's get one more thing before and then we'll leave the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. There are conversations about them undoing decades-old rulings. There are court cases. Can you talk about?
Yeah, mifepristone was approved 20 years ago. It's been used by millions of women in the US and probably tens of millions of women around the world. It was approved in many other countries before it was ever approved here.
Mm-hmm.
And there are no safety issues. In fact, if you look at the FDA's rules for taking a product off prescription and selling it over the counter, the abortion pill fully qualifies.
Mm-hmm.
It is that safe. It's safer than Viagra. It's safer than Tylenol. So there are no safety issues here. The complication rates are very low, and there's lots of experience that makes it absolutely ridiculous
Yes.
that approval would be withdrawn. And if it were up to the scientists in the FDA, they would never consider that.
Of course.
And I'm hopeful that the Supreme Court will consider that a bridge too far.
Yes.
Because it brings into question the entire drug regulatory system in this country. If a group of people opposed to the product can undo a scientific process for approving. And then, one of the objections that they have is that particularly during the pandemic, the rules for distributing the abortion pill were loosened.
Mm-hmm.
And all of the science supported that was the right thing to do, whether there was a pandemic or not.
Yes.
And there's no reason to reverse that. But at least one of the concerns that we have in the reproductive rights field is that the Supreme Court may force the FDA to revoke those measures that made it easier for women to have access to the abortion pill.
Do you think that might happen
Uh,
in this Supreme Court?
I guess I can't believe that we could get to that point in this country, that we would so reject the science behind an FDA approval. It's mind-boggling.
Yes. So I worked at National NARAL, the National Abortion Rights, actually in the mid-'80s. And it seemed like we shouldn't be fighting that battle anymore.
Yeah.
And decades and decades later, we have lost ground rather than gained ground. And especially with this state by state, terrible patchwork,
Yeah, yeah,
especially most recently with Florida. Um,
right. Yeah.
what's your message to young women and men who are struggling with diminished options?
Well, first of all, don't just get out and vote. Send money to pro-choice candidates, get out there and knock on doors, drawing phone canvases. And we need to do this at the local, state, and federal level.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the reason that we're in so much trouble in the 14 states that have banned abortion now is that people who were anti-choice worked very hard behind the scenes for years to take control of those state legislatures.
Mm-hmm.
And those legislatures no longer represent the will of the people, particularly around this issue.
Yes.
But they are still in a position, especially if the governor's office is sympathetic,
Mm-hmm.
to pass horrendous legislation.
Yes.
But I I have to believe that we're in a temporary place, that this will get reversed, and in part because enough people are out there angry about what's happening and will not just go to the polls, but will work the polls.
Yes.
Um,
So the first
and
surprise, oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, and I think history is on our side. The
Mm-hmm.
rest of the world is going in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
There are very few other countries that have liberalized abortion laws and then reversed them.
Yes.
Um, so I, I can't believe we won't turn this around. And I just hope we do it in my lifetime.
Yes, no kidding. So in November in Maryland, abortion
Mhm.
will be on the ballot. There is a measure that would enshrine reproductive freedom in Maryland's Constitution. And when abortion rights have been on the ballot, even in bright red states like Kansas, voters have made very clear that
Right.
they want options.
Yeah.
How do you see it in Maryland and Kansas or wherever you'd like to discuss?
Well, one of the things I worry about a little bit is that we've now got at least 6 ballot issues in various states, including states like Florida, which would be really important to win.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there may not be enough funding to adequately fund all these initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
Outside groups, outside these states are putting money in, but there's only so much to go around.
Sure.
And I worry a little bit, I think it will pass in Maryland, but I also don't think that's good enough. I think we need to knock this ball out of the park
Mm-hmm.
to send a message to other states.
Yes.
But I think it may be hard to raise money for an initiative in Maryland because there's an initiative in Florida and there's an initiative in Montana.
Right.
And those are red states where it would send a really big message if we could pass those referendums.
It would both be so sweet for
Yeah,
Ron DeSantis to lose
yeah.
big in Florida.
Oh, yes. Wouldn't you love
Uh,
that?
he's the worst. So
Yeah.
Sharon, for 10 years, you were president and CEO of the Alan Guttmacher Institute.
Uh-huh.
There was a growth in staff, in budget, all that. Talk about being an advocate and doing policy work.
Well, Guttmacher is the Guttmacher Institute, where we dropped the name Alan
Yes.
early on in an effort to rebrand it as something other than AGI.
I wrote down AGI in my notes, actually, because that's how I know it.
So it is actually a policy research organization,
Mhm.
and more than half of the staff are scientists. So the purpose of the organization is to generate the evidence needed to support good policy change and good program design. And that was, I love the idea of scholar activists,
Mm,
people who advocate strongly for something, but advocate based on
based on
really
data.
solid, rigorous scientific evidence. And that's what Guttmacher did. And I absolutely loved the job. And, I worked with, not just at Guttmacher, but really for a lifetime with exceptional people,
Yeah.
really smart people, really committed, hardworking. Um, in many cases, especially overseas, very courageous. And these were people who could easily have gone to jail.
Mm.
Um,
Well, smart, hardworking, and courageous seems like that defines you, Sharon Camp. Uh, so one of the courageous things you did was use Depo-Provera for many years
Mhm.
before it was even approved. Talk about what that is, how it was effective, and why you chose to use that and take that risk.
Yeah, it's a progestin only injectable, which is good for 3 months. So, 4 shots a year is pretty easy to organize. And it had been approved in a lot of other countries, but
And you
it
used it
developed,
as birth control.
yeah, it's used for birth control,
Right.
right? And it's a progesterone only method. So it's quite safe,
Hmm.
doesn't have any estrogen in it. Um, but it got kind of a bad reputation
Yes.
early on, because people suggested that it would be a really good method for institutionalized women, i.e., women who couldn't make their own decisions. And there was some evidence from overseas where it was in use that women might have been getting injections without fully informed consent.
Yeah.
And so the feminist community really got up in arms about it.
Hmm.
Um, Although they had some safety concerns, which I didn't think were valid, but um, they, I think, had even more concern that this method might be used coercively
Yes.
against low-income women, against women of color,
Yes.
against women who had too many children in somebody's mind.
Hmm.
So the FDA took 13 years to approve it. And
Hmm.
during that time, I went ahead and used it, but I had to get it from overseas some of the time, and had to learn to give myself shots some of the time. But it was a perfectly safe method for me, and I found it really reliable and easy to use. The same thing happened with the first contraceptive implant,
Norplant.
which was called Norplant.
I remember.
And there were judges who were given crack addicted women the
Yes.
choice of having Norplant installed, implanted,
Hmm.
or going to jail.
Hmm.
And so again, this
Coercion.
misuse
Hmm.
against, women not giving informed consent, um, it gave it a bad name. And so
Hmm.
when safety issues arose, which in
Hmm.
my mind weren't a real concern, but when they arose, then, the lawyers got involved, and the company just had to let the product go.
Yes.
But it was a perfectly good implant.
So going back to Margaret Sanger and the earliest advocates for birth control, there were racial issues. Have we moved past? Are we in good shape today? Are we more sophisticated and more egalitarian?
I think we are. It's very clear that the anti-choice lobby would like to paint the reproductive rights community and the family planning providers with that racial brush.
Yes.
And they make all kinds of untrue charges, like the fact that birth control clinics are all located, abortion clinics are all located in low-income communities of color. It's absolutely not true.
Hmm.
Um, I think that there is still in this country very clearly institutionalized racism. It may well be that some people who are supporting family planning programs have that as an ulterior motive, but I think I've known hundreds and hundreds of people working in this field, and in my experience, they are the least racist of any group that you could work with. They're really compassionate people. And the goal in their mind, it always was in my mind, is we want low-income women and women of color to have the same opportunities that middle-income white women have. And that
100%.
is to take control over childbearing,
Hmm.
because it is the most important thing in a woman's life to be able to control.
Hmm. Yes. Just a couple more questions before we start to wrap up and go to our Fast Five. You were just honored by the Planned Parenthood of Maryland and have served on their board and chaired the board for, bless you, for continuing all these years. How is it the intergenerational connections? How are young women, again, I mean, it's sort of pre and post Dobbs, how are they getting active and how are the generations working together?
I don't know that I know the answer to that. Certainly, we have recruited a lot of younger people to the Planned Parenthood board
Yes,
just in the last couple of years. So, the average age of the board has probably dropped 15 years,
it's
which
good.
is great.
Yeah,
And it's much harder for young women to be active around these issues because they're starting a career, they
sure,
may have young families, they're
right,
really busy. So, getting them to come and serve on a nonprofit board
right,
hasn't always been easy.
right.
And we're able to recruit some really exceptional young women, and they're showing real leadership on the board. So I'm hopeful. I think young women in this country needed a real kick in the pants
Yeah,
to get moving, and Dobbs did it for them.
no kidding. So
So
the day that,
yeah,
sorry,
I just hope that they're all going to be active in this election. I'm a little worried,
yes,
but because of dissatisfaction with the candidates,
yes,
that young women may sit at home when we really need them out there, not
yes.
just voting, but knocking on doors.
So the day the Dobbs Supreme Court decision was released, I actually went down. I made homemade signs, and I actually took the metro down to the Supreme Court, and I was so delighted by the number of
Yeah,
young women and men
yeah,
who were
yeah,
out there protesting.
right.
Um, what is the scariest scenario when we talk about this November's elections? Paint the worst case scenario when it comes to women's reproductive options.
Well, I think it's quite possible that Trump will be reelected. Quite possible that Republicans will hold on to the House, although probably with a narrow margin,
Mhm.
and entirely possible that they will flip the Senate, because Democrats are defending more than twice the
Mhm.
number of seats.
Mhm.
And there are some very vulnerable people, and we've already
Including in
lost
Maryland.
West Virginia.
Sorry, I
So
have to interrupt. I have to
yeah,
interrupt because people who think Larry Hogan, our former governor here in Maryland, anyone who thinks he's moderate is fooling themselves. And he vetoed our abortion bill. He is not an
yes,
ally. And
yeah,
even if he were pro-choice, which he's not,
yeah,
his victory would put people like Mitch McConnell, Ted Cruz, Josh Hawley, and all these terrifying people in
exactly.
charge in the Senate. So I'm sorry, continue, but
Yeah.
I have to make
No,
sure I
I
say
mean,
that.
even if he were a Mitt Romney or a
Yes,
Mac Mathias, if you
right.
remember back that far,
Yes,
he's another Republican,
yes.
and he will caucus with the Republicans. And if we lose the Senate, I think about what happened to our judicial system under Trump.
Mhm.
The number of really awful judges
Right.
that took the bench, not just the Supreme Court, but
Mhm.
federal and district courts. If there's another 4 years of a Republican president and a Republican Senate, that justice system will be lost
Mhm.
to any progressive cause
For decades.
for decades.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
All right, let's end on a happier note.
Right.
What is the thing you're proudest of that you've accomplished in your career? And what is your biggest goal left in your future?
Oh, my biggest accomplishment is clearly Plan B. I did some other things that I'm really proud of,
Yes,
but that is the standout for
it's
me.
huge. Yes.
And I'm 80, so I don't have a lot of big goals left. And if I have one, it's to try and stay useful, because I think when we stop feeling useful, we go downhill.
That makes sense. Well, Sharon Camp, mother of Plan B, it is time for Fast Five. Five quick
Okay.
questions, five quick answers. Question number one. What is your favorite trip you've ever taken? What was the destination?
Africa,
Where?
uh, all over. I was
Nice.
in 18 countries hitchhiking across the continent in 1967 for 9 months. And
That's
it was an exceptional trip.
had to be. All right. Question two. You've already mentioned your mom, but name another shero of yours.
Uh, Probably would have been my maternal grandmother,
Okay.
who was raised on a farm and, drove the horses that were pulling the hay wagon. And, she had that women can do anything kind of air about her, even though she was very traditional in many ways, but a really strong woman. And I would like to think if I had lived in that era, I would have driven the horses
I love it.
in front of the hay wagon.
That's great. Question number three. What is something on your bucket list that you would like to get done soon?
I don't think there's much left.
Nice.
Um, I've probably been in 100 countries, so there's no place I really have to travel.
Okay.
Uh, I've done a lot of what I wanted to do. You know,
Fabulous. That's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah, I'm very content.
That's great. Question number four. Who is your favorite artist? That can be an author, a musician, a painter.
Oh, a musician would have to be Ray Charles.
Okay. All right. And question number five, the question that I ask all of my guests. Sharon Camp, mother of Plan B. What is your hidden secret superpower? What is a skill or talent you have, something you're really good at that most folks can't do?
Um, I think maybe it's a level of stubbornness.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah, yeah.
Sharon, thank you so, so much for your whole career, for all that you've done for women's health. And thank you for taking time to kibitz today. It was such an honor.
And it was entirely my pleasure. I had a great time.
Thank you. I look forward
Talk
to
to you
seeing you.
soon.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.